With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right. Even if the whole world is telling you to move. It is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say no. You move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Tactics right here in the Situation Room. Whether you're joining us on YouTube or Twitter or Twitch, Periscope, Facebook, however you happen to be joining us, we certainly appreciate you making us a part of your day. Welcome back, everybody. I know that we had that one special episode, unfortunately, for really terrible circumstances, but we are glad to have you back here on Tactics for the new year 2020, where speech isn't violence, tolerance isn't love, and disagreement isn't hate. With this new year, we do have a lot coming your way. It is technically the second show of the new year. The first show was kind of an emergency situation for those of you who have not heard, and if you haven't seen my special on it, which I did back on Thursday, I highly recommend you head over to my YouTube page or my Facebook page and watch the tribute because, of course, Judge Mark Montiel died. I actually was at the funeral earlier today. This was a devastating loss for the Montgomery community, especially those in the radio industry and those that listen to talk radio. I can't tell you how many people I walked in and not only saw prominent radio listeners, but personalities that were there today on a Monday to pay their respects to Judge Montiel. And I really do ask that you guys continue to keep his family in their prayers, especially because of the nature of his death, it being so incredibly sudden and unexpected. And I do just pray for them and ask all of my audience to do the same. I mean, in a lot of ways, the reason I have a radio career to begin with is because of Mark Montiel, and so it was a very difficult thing for me to deal with. But if you do want more details on that, you want more details on the story itself, and then some of personal stories about me and him and some of the stuff that went on behind the scenes, I highly, highly recommend you go and check out the special that I did on Thursday. It'll be the last episode, I think episode 173, if I'm not mistaken. But for those of you who are here, welcome to the program, and thank you for being with us. There has been a lot that has gone on in the Christmas break, and I'm not even going to try to get caught up on all of it. I'm just going to hit some of the major headlights. We're probably going to hit on some of the stuff I don't hit on today, tomorrow, and that's okay. But I think one of the biggest stories that happened in Montgomery that is interesting that people aren't talking about it as being a local story, because it seems as though it just kind of passed under the radar, and a lot of the local news didn't really cover it all that intensely. Like I think I saw WSFA talk about it once, and I think Alabama News Network did something on it, but it just kind of went straight through. It was Michael Bloomberg, major Democrat presidential candidate here in the capital city of Montgomery, to speak. Now, he didn't have a giant studio audience. He basically, I don't even know if there was anybody in the audience based on the report that I saw. It looked to me more like he came up and did sort of a video conferencing thing, but he was in Montgomery, Alabama, and Bloomberg is, interestingly enough, doing a lot better in the polls than a lot of the Democratic pollsters originally believed that he was going to. Now, I'm not saying that he's a front runner, although he's kind of catching up with some of the front runners, and I think that he has at least a shot because he's the kind of guy that can just pour money into a bunch of ad campaigns, and he's certainly done that in Alabama. I don't know if you've noticed, but there were several ads for former mayor of New York City, Michael Bloomberg, running right here in the state of Alabama. Now, why he was running those ads here, I'm really not sure, because it seems like it would be some time before he got to Super Tuesday and Alabama's Democrat primary, but, you know, I guess that's just his strategy. He's thinking long term, I guess. But yeah, that Michael Bloomberg was here in the capital city last week, and one of the big points of his speech, one of the big national news stories that grew out of the speech like I said, I think a lot of people in the nation didn't even realize he was doing that speech from Montgomery, Alabama. So I'm sure that you're all aware now, and I'm going to give you sort of a quick primer on it. The church shooting in Texas, of course, there was a guy that came up, wound up killing 2 people tragically. Loss of life, no matter how big or how small, is always a tragedy. But the thing that was interesting about this one and was different than a lot of the other mass shootings is that it wasn't a mass shooting. And the reason that it wasn't a mass shooting, because remember that the FBI definition of a mass shooting is when 4 or more people, excluding the shooter, shoots people and it's non-gang related. In other words, it's not crime, it's not a robbery, it's just somebody going out just trying to kill people. So that's what is defined as a mass shooting, and this didn't meet that qualification because only 2 people died. Thank God it didn't qualify as a mass shooting, but it probably would have had it not been for a very brave security guard there, and not even a professional security guard, just a member of the church that volunteers for the security job there, which, I've done at churches before. And a bunch of other members that happen to be armed that were there in case something happened to him and he couldn't take the shot. So I'm going to show you a quick video of this just to give you some background. And by the way, it was difficult to find raw video footage. This actually came from the church's live stream video footage. They live stream their service just like my church at Dalraida does, just like other churches. Probably your church does this. You may not even be aware of it. But they live stream the services on the internet just like I do with my show here. And so because of that, we do have actual video footage, which is pretty rare, of the attempted mass shooting. And so I want to go ahead and show this clip to you, but I do want to warn you because, I always try to do a family show, a show that you could watch with your kids. If you've got little kids in the room, teenagers might be okay, and there's not like blood showing everywhere or anything, but it is incredibly intense, and I'm just warning you right now, it's a couple of people, it's a video of people being murdered, so just keep that in mind before you watch this. If you got kids in the room, might be a good idea to just turn the video off or have them move out of the room for a second. So we're going to go ahead and watch it. Here's the clip. So that's the clip of the West Freeway Church of Christ there in Texas, in White Settlement, Texas. And what I wanted you to notice about that, because you do have to kind of pay attention to the top corner of that video, you'll notice that right off the bat when I showed that clip, you hear 3 shots. The first 2 are the 2 people that the psychopath that invaded this place of worship to try to kill people, those are the 2 people that he killed. One of them died immediately. One of them died actually in transit on the way to the hospital from injuries. But that 3rd shot, that's not him. The 3rd shot is the shot that kills the shooter. And so the security guard, a guy named Jack Wilson, who is being hailed as a hero, and Jack Wilson certainly deserves all of that praise. He is a former police officer, and if you listen to some of his commentary on what happened there, he said, I tell people to shoot center of mass, which any good shooting instructor will tell you to do. But he said, I didn't see that shot. I saw a headshot, so I went ahead and took it. It happens 6 seconds after the guy pulls a gun. So from the time the guy comes and pulls his gun out to the time that Jack Wilson shoots him, it's only 6 seconds. That's an extremely short response time. And think about this. If that guy can kill 2 people in only 6 seconds, how much worse would this have been if that response time had been significantly longer? I want you to keep that in mind as we're going through this analysis here. But that shot from Jack Wilson, if that hadn't worked, and thank God it did, but if that hadn't worked, you'll notice, and you can watch, and it's coming from every direction because there were people scattered throughout the congregation, and that's probably not even done in a way that they planned it. It's probably just happenstance because that's where the members happen to be. This is Texas. So there are 5 other members, so including Jack Wilson, 6 people in total that pull out their sidearm and are ready to go, ready to try to take the shooter down. So even if, God forbid, Jack Wilson misses or the guy shoots Jack Wilson, who was the guy that wound up shooting him, even if that happens, you've got 5 other people with their guns all trained on him. There was just no way that this guy was going to be able to take very many more lives. Now, maybe that first shot misses and he's able to kill 1 or maybe even 2 more people. But that doesn't happen because even if he had missed, you've got other people there ready to go with their firearms. One of them was going to hit him. And you'll also notice that each of the members of the congregation that are unarmed, what do? They scatter, they get down, they get behind the pews, which is exactly what they're supposed to do. Now, there may have been somebody that just stood up and started running. I didn't see that if that's the case, or if they did run, they were running and sort of huddled down. So that's really interesting because this church did have a security plan. We know that from what they told us afterward. They had an interview with Wilson. They had an interview with the minister, all of that. They did have a security plan, but I would imagine that didn't include like some kind of seminar to each of the members. They just did what came natural to them. And that was part of what allowed the security guard there to be able to take this guy out so quickly. Because human beings naturally, they know to get down when gunfire happens. And so because of that, they were able to give this guy a clean shot at the guy's head, and he was able to take him out very, very quickly. So major props to Jack Wilson on being able to pull this off. Now, comes the local tie-in here, because Michael Bloomberg just happened to be in Montgomery. I believe it was the day after the shooting took place, and he decided, because remember, Michael Bloomberg is the guy who runs and owns Everytown for Gun Safety, which is the single biggest anti-gun lobby in the country. And so Bloomberg decided this is one of his pet issues, and so he was going to comment on it. So this is Michael Bloomberg from the capital city, Montgomery, Alabama, commenting on this story.
It may be true, I wasn't there, I don't know the facts, that somebody in the congregation had their own gun and killed the person who murdered 2 other people, but it's the job of law enforcement to have guns and to decide when to shoot. You just do not want the average citizen carrying a gun in a crowded place.
All right, so Michael Bloomberg here, in his own words, saying, well, I don't know all the facts and I wasn't there. First of all, that's like the best intro to anything Michael Bloomberg has ever said. I don't have all the facts, which tends to be a tendency with him, is that he decides to comment on things before he knows the facts. And you notice that's part of the reason, not the only reason, but part of the reason here on Tactics, we never make political commentary out of a tragedy, out of a situation like this, until at least 48 hours has transpired. I think that it's not only appropriate for the families, but also, and this is probably just as much, if not more important, and make sure that we're not giving you information that is incorrect, and we're not speculating and giving analysis on information that is wrong. And so that's a mistake, something that Bloomberg really steps in it with this one. But the other part of that, the most important part of that he's saying here from Montgomery, is that you don't want an average citizen with a firearm. You don't want an average person with a gun shooting into a crowded area. Yeah, with this guy, who, by the way, is a former police officer, which means he has police officer training, but let's also not forget that he is an average citizen. He is not a police officer. That he was able to draw his personal firearm very quickly and eliminate the target, eliminate the threat to his congregation, members of his own spiritual family, very quickly. There is no telling how many lives this guy saved by doing that. And if he hadn't done it, there were 5 other members there that were ready to do the exact same thing. But the thing is, to Michael Bloomberg, you are better off completely defenseless. You are better off just not having that option at all to defend yourself. He would rather these people be in a room with, I would guess about 150, 200, maybe 250 people in that church based on the angle that I saw. I'm sure there were people off screen I couldn't see. But let's say there were roughly that many people in that auditorium. He would rather those people be at the mercy of a psychopath. And to prove my point, because of course he would say, well, if Michael Bloomberg had his way, then this guy wouldn't have a gun. Yeah, here's the thing. That guy was a felon. Wasn't supposed to have a gun. He is already somebody that would have been disqualified according to our national background check system. He would not be able to purchase a firearm, yet he got one somehow. It's almost like crazy people that want to kill people with guns don't care if they violate laws to get their firearm. You see, the only thing that Michael Bloomberg's laws would have done is disarmed the 6 people in the audience, not the psychopath that came in with a gun to kill people. And then those people would have been left at the guy's mercy. Now let's do a comparison here. Sutherland Springs, another church shooting that happened in Texas. Sutherland Springs, how many people died? 26. And what was the difference? There was nobody in the church with a gun. Oh, and by the way, let's remember that in Sutherland Springs, it was not a police officer that took the guy down. Now, that would have, been fine if that had happened, but it was not a police officer that took down the shooting in Sutherland Springs. It was a guy that lived near the church that heard gunfire that grabbed his personal firearm, by the way, not a police officer, who grabbed his AR-15, went out there, and took the guy out. And based on everything we know about that case, that shooter was leaving the church building to go shoot another church building. We know that this guy had a plan. This has been confirmed by news reports. He was going to try to kill more people. But what stopped him? A good guy with a firearm who happened to be outside the church that heard the commotion and came by. Can you imagine how fewer people would have died in Sutherland Springs if there had been even one person, much less 6 people, with firearms inside the church? Yet to Michael Bloomberg, his political agenda and being able to control your choices to make decisions for you because you're not smart enough to decide whether or not you should own a gun, that's a decision that you're just not smart enough to make. And so Bloomberg, the king of the nanny state, I mean, there's a reason that New York, you couldn't even buy freaking sugar or buy a Coke that was larger than 16 ounces. You see, to him, controlling your life and controlling your decisions is just more important than your life. I mean, look, if some people have to die, well, that's a sacrifice Michael Bloomberg is willing to make. It's kind of like if you've ever seen Trek, and I wanted to play this clip, but because of copyright infringement issues, I can't. It's kind of like in Shrek. You remember the original Shrek where Lord Farquaad is there and he says in him going out and sending all these people to go rescue the princess for him, he says, well, some of you may die, but it's a sacrifice I am willing to make. That's Michael Bloomberg saying, look, I get that, some people are going to die, that some people in these mass shootings are going to get shot. Hey, that's just a sacrifice we're going to have to make if we want gun control. And what astounds me is the Democrats still consider themselves the party of compassion and caring about people. No, if you cared about people, you would want them to be able to have the option of carrying firearms to defend themselves, because you'll notice Michael Bloomberg doesn't go anywhere without armed security. The man doesn't go to the bathroom without armed security all the time. Now, he's not going to disarm his security. The average citizen, the neophytes, the little people, we don't want those people with guns shooting in crowded areas. No, they might hurt somebody. Yeah, well, here's the thing. if I've got a choice between being in a room full of people with one psychopath with a gun, and that's it, he's the only one that's armed, or I can be in a room with one psychopath with a gun and a couple people I have no idea who they are with guns, you know what? I'm going to play the odds and say I'd rather have more people with guns, even if I don't know them, just on the off chance that they might want to help me. That's still better odds than having somebody that I know for a fact wants to kill me that has the gun in the room. Yeah, I'm going to roll the dice on that one, okay? And I don't want people like Michael Bloomberg taking away the average citizen's ability to make those decisions, because I can't afford armed security guards like him. I am my own security. Now, I would like to be able to afford armed security guards. That would be a nice thing, but the average person can't do that. That's why we have to arm ourselves and be our own first responders. Because you'll notice he said in there, it's like, well, the thing is, we really don't want the average citizen doing that. It's law enforcement's job to make those kinds of decisions. Look, you will find few people that are a fiercer advocate for our police officers than me. And I think if you've been watching this show for any amount of time, you know that. However, they are not gods. They're not Rambo. And there are police officers, I'm sure, that because of their training shoot a lot better than me. I'm sure that there are also police officers that I'm probably a better shot than. And that's not to brag. I mean, I'm a pretty good shot. But the thing is, having police officer training doesn't automatically make you some kind of untouchable John Wayne character that can, curve a bullet around something. That's not a thing. And this is clearly the idea of somebody that doesn't know anything about guns. If they had do you know what the average response time for an emergency like this is? The average police response time is roughly 30 minutes, but that's for a situation where they don't know that somebody is going to be in imminent danger. So, if I'm not mistaken, the last time I looked at the statistics, if it's some kind of emergency situation, in other words, they know that there's an active shooter, the average response time is roughly 7 to 7.5 minutes. Like I said, this guy killed 2 people in only 6 seconds. How many more people could he have killed if they had to wait on the police officers to get there? Let's just say he shot 10 more people. Well, he could do that in under a minute, still get away, and then be at large and then kill more people. He would still have several minutes between that and the average police response time to get away. Look, I love our police officers. I think that they do a great job. They have a very difficult job. But they can't be everywhere at once. And unless you have somebody in the room, in the room with the shooter with you, the response time is not going to be fast enough to save lives like it was in this situation. And that's a hard reality that Michael Bloomberg does not want to admit to. But here's the thing. I don't know if you noticed, but if you look over to Bloomberg's right, your left on the screen, you'll notice there's somebody standing with him. Montgomery's new mayor, Stephen Reed. Now, I had my own thoughts about Stephen Reed in the election, and he was not going to be my first choice. But just like any other elected official, I was like, all right, let's see what he does when he gets into office. This is not a great first impression to make on me or the people of Montgomery. Siding up and buddying up with Mayor Bloomberg. Now, he didn't endorse him, but he does appear directly next to Mayor Bloomberg saying crazy stuff like this and doesn't denounce him. Just like 1 Corinthians 15:33 says, bad company does corrupt good morals. Mayor Reed, this is hardly a way to get off on the right foot, buddying up with people like Mayor Bloomberg. Somebody that would rather people die just to get his political agenda through. That's not somebody you want to be on the same side with. And unfortunately, Bloomberg is not the only person in this particular mindset. There was a USA Today op-ed that said that it was just a shame that this is going to be used as an example for the pro-gun lobby. It was just a shame that people were going to talk about this being a good thing for the Second Amendment. Her name was Elvia Diaz, and she wrote this op-ed in USA Today, and this is a direct quote from it. But we know nothing about at least 6 other parishioners who also appeared to draw their handguns at the West Freeway Church of Christ in White Settlement, Texas. Quote, and that's terrifying. So, according to her, it's terrifying that there were other people in the congregation that may not have had police training like Jack Wilson, and that scares her. Again, if I got to choose between, now these wouldn't be strangers in your church because you would know a lot of the people in your church, presumably. In fact, at my church, there's probably a few people that carry that I don't know that they carry, but just about everybody that carries there, I know them. I know several of them that carry just like I do. I feel a lot safer with those people. Even if it was a complete stranger, never seen them before in my life, I'd 10 times rather have a person with a gun there that is not one of the killers, is not trying to hurt me, that is trying to take down the other guy, than I would just left defenseless and to this guy's mercy. It's absolutely insane, and it goes back to this mentality with the left that the gun itself is scary. Anybody that has a gun is scary. Doesn't matter what their intent is, doesn't matter if they're trying to hurt people, trying to protect people, doesn't matter. A person with a gun is scary. It makes no sense whatsoever. But this is where these people are. I would 1,000 times rather have this person, because here's the thing that you don't think about with this. As somebody that conceals and carries myself, part of the reason that this is an effective strategy is because once I fire a shot, even if I miss, first of all, I'm not going to make a shot where I might hit somebody else. And you saw in this video, whether these people were trained or not, they had good enough sense. They weren't firing indiscriminately into the crowd. They wanted to kill one person. They wanted to take out one person because he was the one that was a danger to everyone else. And even if one of these people had missed, even if I was the only person with a gun other than the shooter in the room, and I fire at the guy and I miss, I'm protecting people. Why? Because now I'm the target. You see, he could just fire indiscriminately before and kill a whole lot of people. Once I've fired my gun, even if I don't come close to hitting him, now I'm the only target he's worried about, and he's trying to kill me, trying to shoot one person, which is a lot harder to do than shooting a whole bunch of people. And so that's the difference. Now what I have done is I have distracted him and given other people time to get away, given other people time to mount a defense, and now I'm the only person that he's worried about taking down, as opposed to just spraying bullets and trying to fire into a crowd. So even if I don't hit him on the first try, I have helped out everybody there. And by the way, I know that. I'm willing to do that. That's part of my job as somebody that carries a firearm. I haven't taken an oath. I'm not a police officer or a deputy or anything like that. That's part of my personal responsibility that I take on every single time I walk out the door with my sidearm on me. And I know that. And that's something that I'm willing to do. Now, I hope that I would be a good enough shot to hit him on the first try, and that doesn't matter. But if what has to happen is that I become a target for that guy that distracts him from hurting anybody else, that's something that I'm willing to do. And I know that going into the situation. And it's one of the reasons that I do get really agitated with people like Bloomberg and this lady from USA Today that are essentially saying, no, we don't trust the average person with a gun. We don't trust them to try to protect people. Look, that's an enormous responsibility, and every single person that I know that does carry takes it that seriously and is willing to lay their life down for other people, sometimes even strangers, if that's what it takes. And we see this happen in America over and over again. 3 to 5 times the rate of gun homicides in the country are defensive uses of firearm. We have well over 3 to 5 times that in defensive uses of firearms. And no, the average person, I don't find that scary at all. And one other thing, just kind of a parting shot. These people aren't parishioners. This isn't a Catholic church. We don't have parishes. So she also gets that part of it wrong. That's just a minor thing, though. And there's one other person that seems to have a similar mentality. Elizabeth Warren spoke on this the other day, another frontrunner for the Democrat Party.
Last week, there was another church shooting. And the only thing that saved the rest of the congregation were the other 2 people who shot and took out the shooter. Would you support a universal concealed carry law for everyone in the country who's willing to be licensed and checked by the government?
No.
So Elizabeth Warren, unqualified, no explanation, no. Just don't want people to have concealed carry. Don't want people to be carrying guns. Just one more Democrat, somebody that very likely could be the Democrat nominee for the next year. No, just don't want people to have guns in public at all. I mean, that's what that boils down to, because here's the thing. When it comes to Elizabeth Warren, she is looking at this, and this is the way the question is phrased. He's not leaving any wiggle room. He's not leaving it vague. He's not saying just random people carrying, even though that's really what the Second Amendment, would lead us to believe the founders intended. That's not even what he's talking about. He says, would you support universal carry for people that have been specifically licensed and vetted by the government? Nope, not even then. So you don't want people that have been licensed and done background checks and all of that. You don't want those people carrying. Nope, don't want that. Elizabeth Warren does not want people carrying guns, period. That's the only logical explanation for this, because here's the thing. There is another explanation, but it's not the one that works for Elizabeth Warren. I actually also disapprove of universal concealed carry laws, but for completely different reasons than Elizabeth Warren. And the reason that I know this is because Elizabeth Warren is not a 10th Amendment advocate. She's not a Federalist. And because of that, she's not a states' rights person. Now, I would say that it would be a violation of one state's rights to say that another state gets to dictate what kind of licenses they'll accept, which ones that they'll give the nod to, which is, by the way, one of the primary reasons that I'm opposed to the Obergefell decision that made gay marriage licenses basically universal. Well, if they get married in one state, regardless of what your state thinks about it, you have to recognize that as a legal marriage license. Now, I'm not going to get off into that subject, but I'm saying it's the same reason that I oppose that. A state should not be able to dictate to a different state what they're going to observe, and they can just pass laws and the other state has to observe it. I don't think that that's right at all. But that ain't why Elizabeth Warren is against it. Elizabeth Warren is against it in principle. In other words, she doesn't think that people should be carrying at all, not even people that are vetted and licensed by the government. Now, I would be perfectly fine with as many people as possible, licensed or not, carrying firearms. But Elizabeth Warren doesn't even want them to be able to get a license and be vetted and to be able to carry. That's what's so terrifying about that exchange. We've looked a lot at people that really just do not have the right idea about this. They're not looking at it with the right kind of vision. But I want to share with you today somebody that was, and he was a member of this congregation, a guy named John Richardson. And he just perfectly characterized the entirety of what is going on here. This is a longtime member of the West Freeway Church of Christ, in his own words about what took place that day where he lost 2 of his brothers in Christ to this horrific psychopath that decided he was going to come in and kill people. And luckily, and thank God, there were people there that were willing to defend life. And this was his reaction to that.
Well, the only problem is that we have to understand that evil is everywhere, and that no matter preaching or teaching, if evil's going to try to do something horrible, evil's going to do something horrible. And so it is. All you can do is do your best to stop evil from happening to more people. That's all you can do. And you have to go on, and we have to understand that this poor man, I don't know what his mental state was, but my heart goes out to his family because they have to live with this. And we have, I know he took some lives, but we have to remember he's a creature of God also, just like we are. And it was a sad thing that he had to come into the congregation and hurt people, and it's a sad thing that we had to hurt him. But I don't have any hate for this person. We can't have hate for these people. We can't have hate for anybody that does hate for us. We have to go on, we have to live that life of Christ that wants us to teach and preach and be that example of his on earth to every person we can meet. And that's all we can do. We just have to pick up the pieces and go and just take care of who we can, take care of, and appreciate every moment you have, and love everybody with the love of Christ that you can love.
You know, there are a few times, as somebody that follows news stories like this, and specifically somebody that talks about tragedies and big national stories like I do from time to time, off the top of my head, and there may be other occasions, off the top of my head, I can only remember 2 other occasions where I've heard something that profound and that filled with the grace of God. One was the Emmanuel Church in South Carolina, where you'll remember there was a white nationalist piece of trash that invaded that church building and shot 9 people and killed them. And hearing the families talk about how they love that person, they forgave him, and they would want to be able to talk to him about Jesus being able to forgive him too. And then again, with the death of and murder of Botham Jean and Botham Jean's brother, talking about how he forgave his brother's murderer and wanted her to ask for forgiveness and give her life over to Christ. You notice that the people that are able to do this, that bear no hatred in their heart, that want no ill to come to this person, you notice what they all have in common? It's not hard to connect the dots here. It's not, some of the hard-hitting political analysis that I normally do. It's really simple. They had a biblical worldview. They had a worldview that God created us. We're all God's children. And as evil as a person may be, and evil does exist in the world, that's part of the biblical worldview too. As evil as a person may be, they are still somebody that is created in God's image. They may have marred that image. They may have turned their back on God. They may have embraced the darkness and the hatred that is in their heart to the point that they are willing to kill other of God's children. But ultimately, they are still God's creation. And we still have a responsibility to love them and to help them to turn their life around, to turn their life back to Christ. You see, guys like this, John Richardson, and Botham Jean's little brother, and the families of the people at the Emmanuel Church, those are people that their entire world is painted through the lens of living like Christ. That's how they're able to do that. It defies all human logic and reason, and you guys know what a big fan I am of logic and reason. It defies any sort of earthly wisdom. It all goes back to the fact that they are trying to live their lives the way Jesus Christ lived his. And when you look at that, when you look at the story of Christ, and see that this was a man that was pleading with God to forgive the people that were his murderers while they were in the process of murdering him, I'm sorry, that's the only way you get to that worldview. You can't get there through Allah. You can't get there through whatever Hindu gods are there. You can't get there through secularism or human reason or atheism or any of the other isms that we might talk about. The only way to get to that point is having a worldview that includes Jesus Christ. That's it. There are no other ways. And we've spent the better part of a half hour now talking about how political pundits have been looking at this story and how it's been a football to throw back and forth, and they're trying so hard to paint it in one particular way or the other. This is a guy that's looking at it the correct way, that he has his priorities in order, that he's looking at it primarily through, okay, when I say this to these people, how do I convey the love of Christ in my message? That's the most important thing. That's what so many other people were missing in this. And it is a responsibility that I take seriously, and I don't know if I would have that kind of strength, but I pray that I would. But I tell you this, if you do want to have that kind of worldview, there is one path to take, and that is the path of following Jesus Christ. There is no other way to get there. And before we do go to a break, I did want to address one other little piece of this. There have been, and I wanted to address this because it was kind of floating around in the Alabama news media, there has been a renewed call for protections in Alabama in case something like this were to happen. But here's the thing. Alabama State Representative Lynn Greer from Rogersville has proposed basically what would be a stand your ground law that would take place, and it would apply to churches specifically. Now, in principle, I agree with this because I don't think that you don't have a duty to flee inside that worship service. In fact, the reason that only 2 people died is because there were several people, most people fled or ducked, but there were 6 people that didn't, and they were willing to take this guy out instead to keep more loss of life from happening. And so I definitely understand the importance of this. However, there is no duty to retreat in a place of worship, and this was something that was corroborated by Attorney General Steve Marshall. So he put out a statement saying essentially the same thing that I thought when I first saw this. So I'm not against the law in principle, but it is definitely redundant, and that's the reason I don't think that it's really necessary. Here is a part of Alabama law. This is Section 13A 323A of the Alabama Code. A person is justified in using physical force upon another person in order to defend himself or herself from a third person from what he or she reasonably believes to be the use or imminent use of unlawful physical force by that person, and he or she may use a degree of force which he or she reasonably believes is necessary for the purpose. A person may use deadly physical force if the person reasonably believes that another person is using or about to use unlawful deadly physical force. So I know that that was an awful lot of legalese, but what it all really boils down to, and all you really need to know, is it's saying if somebody's going to hurt you or going to hurt somebody else, and you believe that they are going to, just like the situation that we saw in this church, then you don't have to flee. You are perfectly within your legal rights to use physical force, even deadly physical force, when that takes place. So, is a stand your ground law specifically carving out a protection for churches a bad thing? I don't think necessarily, but it's certainly unnecessary. I'm not against it because I disagree with what the law is trying to do. It's more that it's redundant. And another thing that it could do is you could make the legal argument, I don't think the legal argument would stand, but you could make the legal argument, okay, well, if there's a specific protection for places like churches, then we can assume that the same protection would not apply to just being in the street or being in a restaurant or something like that. Well, no, it does. The way that the law reads now is that it's everywhere. If you believe somebody is going to try to kill you, then you have the ability to stand up and defend yourself and to use deadly physical force against them. That's the way the law stands in Alabama right now. So it seems like the law would, at the absolute best, be benign, at worst be used as an argument for this not applying to places that aren't places of worship. So I just see it as being a really redundant law that we really just don't need. But really where this all boils down to is that God does protect us, but he also expects us to be ready to defend ourselves. You can see this with David, because of course King David, he had faith in God. He wandered around for the better part of 20 years, waiting for God's promise of him being king of Israel to be fulfilled. Still carried a sword. Did he believe God was going to protect him? Oh yeah, absolutely did. You can see in the fact that he does not kill King Saul twice, even though he has the opportunity, that he has complete trust that God is going to fulfill his promise in his own time. Still carried a weapon. Still thought that it was part of his responsibility and that maybe God's protection of him would come through him having a weapon. But the point is, he had a duty to sustain himself. And God was going to help him with that, but he still had to be prepared. Same thing with Peter. You'll recall that when Jesus was talking with his apostles, he said, if a man does not have a sword, have him sell his cloak and take a sword with him. Now, Jesus was all about keeping the peace as much as humanly possible. We're commanded later by his apostle in Romans to, as much as it is possible with you, make peace with all men. But he also believed in being prepared for when that peace fails you. You see, self-defense is a God-given, inborn human right. And when a government tries to subvert that, when a government tries to take that away from you, they are acting in open defiance of God's natural law. And that is why, to my dying breath, I will defend the Second Amendment, and more importantly and more broadly speaking, the right for each human individual to defend their own life from attack. That is a basic God-given right. And when a government tries to get in the way of that, they are trying to subvert God's natural order. All right, so we're going to go to a break here in a second, and we'll be back in just a moment.
Hey, where you going? Champ? Slugger? Hey, cowboy. Where you going? Where you going?
I'm going out!
Hey everybody, it's Caleb here, and I was just driving through South Alabama. I had a couple quick thoughts that I'd like to share with you. First of all, I really love it when the environmentalists tell us that there just are not enough trees, that we're killing all the trees, that there are no trees out there. As you can probably see through the window there, South Alabama is just trees. There's virtually nothing. You got maybe Andalusia, Enterprise, and Dothan, and trees, and that's pretty much it, other than Gulf Shores, which is the beach. So I genuinely believe that it should be part of our criminal justice system that any liberal that whines too much about there not being enough trees, that their sentence, their punishment for that, should be to drive through South Alabama, because they will be immediately disillusioned about this idea that there are just not enough trees left in the world. There is nothing but trees for miles and miles and miles and miles. Another thing that I wanted to bring up, and it actually made me harken back to a comment that was made, I would say a few months ago, by Hillary Clinton, talking about how the coast, in other words, the people in California and Oregon and Washington and then New England, that they all voted for her and everybody else voted for Trump, which, you know, is true. And then she also talks about trying to essentially explain why that is. She says that, well, all the dynamic people, all the movers and shakers and the people that are making money, those are the ones that voted for me, It was the neophytes, the little people over in flyover country that voted for Trump. And goodness knows that I'm not the world's biggest Trump supporter. I didn't even vote for the guy in the first election. But one of the reasons that she lost that election in the first place, and one of the reasons that Americans in general are just so tired of that, is because there is a large contingency of the left that genuinely believes that only people in the cities are the ones that are dynamic and important. And I'm driving through South Alabama, and right now it's mostly just trees, but especially when you get a little bit further north. I was driving through here and I noticed there's so many fields with cattle and hay, and you get a little bit further south and you're going to see an awful lot of cotton and peanuts and some soybeans. And so I really do think, and I think that this is important to remember, that though there are people in the cities that tend to vote Democrat and have never seen a farm, have never been through, quote unquote, the flyover country, I think it's incredibly important for us to remember that, yeah, they may look their nose down at people like that, but if you were to actually take one of those people and have them try to survive in an environment where there were not the people producing their food and their fiber in states like Alabama, that those cities would immediately devolve into chaos and die. And I think it's so hilarious that the people in cities look down their nose at people in the country, people in farmland, that kind of thing, and then they wouldn't even be able to begin to have a similar lifestyle that they do if it were not for those people. And maybe I'm thinking about this because I'm an ag major and state convention for the Alabama FFA is coming up. But what it really all boils down to is that whether they appreciate it or not, whether or not they understand the relationship between their life and what they're doing and people in places like this that provide the lumber for the house that they live in or the building that they work in, and provide the cotton for their clothes and provide the food that goes on their table, they would quickly learn an appreciation once that stuff went away. Once they realized that the magic bread fairy doesn't just bring bread to the supermarket, that there are people involved in the growth and production and transportation of that, I think it would really paint it in a different light. And what I mean by that is, I don't think that it's productive for us to go out and talk about how silly and stupid they are and how ridiculous their position is on that, even though there's some truth to it. I think we do better catching more flies with honey than vinegar and explain to them and talk to them and educate them about the important role of middle America to the rest of the world, to the rest of the economy. Because the reason that we are an economic powerhouse, the reason that we have so many people that don't have to be involved directly in growing their own food and wondering where their food's going to come from one day to the next, the best way to do that is through education and helping them to understand that that is an important part of it. So let's just try to come at it from a diplomatic perspective, and hopefully they'll be able to realize at that point that it's important for them to appreciate the American farm.
And welcome back. So as you can tell from my background, and I mentioned it at the top of the hour, it is 2020. This is our first episode of the new year, so I wanted to go ahead and give you our top 10 stories, and I thought about this and how to do this. We've already done top 5 stories of the year. We do that every year. This year is special because it's the beginning of a decade, so I thought we'd do something really cool here for New Year's. We're going to do the top 10 stories of the decade, both for Alabama and for national. Now, this is tactics. Local news always takes priority. So we're going to give you the top 10 stories for the decade in the state of Alabama first, then national. Number 10. Now, this is one that is near and dear to my heart. The Kick Six. So the 2013 Iron Bowl ended in one of the strangest and most exciting ways humanly possible. And I think that this is made even more special by the fact that the call on this was by the late, great Rod Bramlett. You know, this was a hard year to be an Auburn fan. And I'm not talking about because we had 4 losses. I mean, obviously that didn't make it easier. But I'm saying regardless of how well we did, this was a rough year to be an Auburn fan because we lost Pat Sullivan and Rod Bramlett in very sudden fashion, in tragic ways, in the same year. And so this is a friend of mine, somebody that I actually did get to work with and had the privilege of knowing over at Auburn Network, radio legend Rod Bramlett with his most famous call of all.
So I guess if this thing comes up short, he can field it and run it out. All right, here we go. 56-yarder. Does not have the leg. And Chris Davis takes it in the back of the end zone. He'll run it out to the 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50, 45. There goes Davis. Oh, my God. Davis is going to run it all the way back. Auburn's going to win the football game. Auburn's going to win the football game. He ran the missed field goal back. He ran it back 109 yards. They're not going to keep him off the field tonight. Holy cow. Oh, my God. Auburn wins. Auburn has won the Iron Bowl. Auburn has won the Iron Bowl in the most unbelievable fashion you will ever see. I cannot believe it. 34-28. And we thought a miracle in Jordan Hare was amazing. Oh, my Lord in heaven. Chris Davis just read it. 109 yards. And Auburn is going to the championship game.
Man, one of the greatest moments in all of sports history. I think that ESPN actually did a video, or they did some kind of countdown of like the most memorable college football plays of all time, and kick six, if I'm not mistaken, was first. There's a lot of college football history. The way that the Iron Bowl ended that way, and yes, the rivalry made a big deal out of it, and yes, the strange but incredible nature of the play made a big difference. But what's so cool about this is this was one of those things that it means a lot to Auburn fans, of course. And of course, and I'm not trying to rub it in, but, you know, it was a devastating loss for Alabama to lose in a game that was just that close. But ultimately, it did lead to Auburn making an appearance to play for the national championship, wound up losing to Florida State. But there were people for years and years afterward talking about this play. And the nature of it, the way that it just had so many big national implications, there were people that were not Auburn or Alabama fans that didn't care, that were watching this and have seen it over and over again. That was a big deal for the state of Alabama. Now, number 9, the 50th anniversary of the Selma March, which happened in 2015. Now, understand, I'm not saying that it's the 9th most important thing in Alabama history, because if it were the actual first Selma March, definitely it would be higher on the list. But because it was the 50th anniversary, it's the anniversary of it. Now, 50th anniversary is still a big deal for the Selma March. And I actually remember it was the day that I interviewed for my radio job over at Cumulus Media Montgomery, because I came through the traffic while they were setting up for bringing the marchers over for the 50th anniversary march. And the historic presence of that, and I do hate, in some ways I really hate that Alabama's racial history makes it sort of the target of ire, but in certain ways, I'm certainly not glad that it happened here. But the really cool thing about it is that Alabama is the cradle of the civil rights movement. I mean, that's something to be proud of. The people of the state of Alabama, most of them black, but some of them of different colors, they are what really started the whole thing. This is the state where finally, you know, part of the reason that it is the cradle of the civil rights movement is because it was really bad here, and it was. But that is something to be proud of, that even though there were an awful lot of people in the state of Alabama that had the wrong idea about that there were enough people in the state that were willing to say, no, it's not right to treat people differently because of the color of their skin. That is something to be proud of. And that's one of the reasons that it is such a big deal, that even though it's not the original event, even though it's just the 50th anniversary, that it definitely deserves a spot on the list. Number 8, and this is going to be another sports-related one. Alabama sports dominates, and that was the entire decade. People from other states will tell me all the time, you don't realize how lucky you are if you're a football fan to be in the state of Alabama. Now, Texas will have similar things to this, but that's partly because Texas is, ridiculously huge and has so many different teams. In the state of Alabama, which has a tiny population compared to a lot of other states, you think about how dominant we were. And a lot of it had to do with Nick Saban. And as an Auburn fan, I don't have a problem admitting that. Saban was a lot of it. I mean, for Pete's sake, this is the first year that we've had a playoff that Alabama was not in it. That's absurd. But that's how dominant Alabama has been in sports. But remember that we started out the decade with Auburn winning the 2010 national championship and then having another appearance 3 years later in 2013 right after the kick six. It is unreal how often in this past decade that the Iron Bowl has had real huge national implications on who becomes the national championship in college football. It's staggering to think how many times that has been something that the Iron Bowl was going to determine. So there's been a lot of domination from Alabama, but Auburn's been a major player. And here's another thing that a lot of people don't think about. I know that they're not big Division I schools, but Troy and UAB have had a pretty impressive amount of success for their size. Remember that a couple of years ago, Troy is the one that bumped off LSU. And you should remember also that Troy, there's a reason that Division I schools are afraid to play them, because they're seen as kind of an underdog, but they'll sneak up and win one on you, even against really tough opponents occasionally. And UAB, even though they had the whole turmoil of not even having a football team for a little while, came back and had an amazing amount of success in their division. So Alabama been incredibly dominant this decade when it comes to football especially, but also in other sports. I mean, you also look at Auburn going to the Final Four. First time a team from the state of Alabama has ever done that in baseball. Alabama and Auburn have had a decent amount of success going to the College World Series in college baseball. So this has been a very, very good decade for Alabama sports. All right, number 7. Jeff Sessions named the Attorney General. That happened, of course, in 2017. So our own Senator Jeff Sessions becomes the Attorney General for the United States. Now, that was a pretty big deal. Not only did it have national implications, and we had a guy, an actual Alabamian, sitting in the president's cabinet in some of the most important meetings that are going on in this country, but also because of the controversial nature, and I'm not going to get into the whole Sessions fight right now because I've explained my position on that probably no less than a dozen times on the show. But the fact that he was in the news so much that there was somebody from the state of Alabama, that just became a massive news story. There were people on the left and the right that liked him and didn't like him. So it just depended on what day of the week it was, it seemed like, as to how people felt about Jeff Sessions. But Jeff Sessions being Alabama's long-term senator that became the top law enforcement official, with the exception of the president, in our country, that was a really big deal for the state of Alabama. Number 6, and this one you have to go way back on, early in the decade, April 2011. The tornadoes hit Tuscaloosa, Birmingham. Some of the details on this are just staggering. It was an EF4 vortex tornado that at one point reached 1.5 miles wide. Think about that. 1.5 miles wide? That is a massive tornado. And it had winds that were measured up to, or estimated to be, 190 miles per hour. This thing, in a very short amount of time, went the span of Tuscaloosa to Birmingham. It actually tore up parts of Birmingham, a large part of the city of Tuscaloosa. $2.4 billion. That is the most damage that any tornado or tornado system has ever caused in the history of the country. Is just a massive toll. And what's far more staggering was the toll in lives. 64 people lost their lives in those horrible storms back in 2011. And that is something that the country and the world really mourned for what had happened in the state of Alabama, and that was something that was a running story for several months that put Alabama in the national and even international news, unfortunately. Number 5, the Mike Hubbard scandal of 2016. Remember that he was found guilty on 12 out of his 23 felony charges. And somehow the guy still has not found his way into prison yet. So far, there's still appeals going on. The thing about Mike Hubbard that is so tragic, the guy, and I actually knew him personally. I wasn't like close to him or anything, but I did work for him over at Auburn Network. It's something that he really should have just had the good sense to stay away, but that's the thing about politics, and this is why it's so terrifying. This game has a way of sucking you in and making you believe, oh, it's not going to happen to you. You don't have to worry about this. It really does make people think that they're above the law. And that was the folly of Speaker Mike Hubbard, who, by the way, let's remember that in the state of Alabama, the way that our Constitution is structured, in a lot of ways, Speaker of the House is the most powerful person in the state government. This is a guy that rose to the height of power in the state and lost it because he could not say no to his own greed. He could not say no to that extra money that he was going to be making on the side and profiting off of his position in the state House of Representatives. That's something Mike Hubbard just could not do. And that's one of the reasons it was so intriguing and also so tragic. I mean, I hated to see that happen to Speaker Hubbard. But the guy just would not stop. He heard that siren call and he answered it. And I think this is incredibly timely. I was sitting with some friends of I was sitting with some friends this morning at the funeral, at Montiel's funeral, and one of the good friends of the judge, AJ, Brother AJ, he may be watching right now. I don't know. He watches the show occasionally. He said, you know what? He tried to tell Mike Hubbard, don't do it. Don't mess with it. Stay away from it. Distance yourself from it. And he's right. I remember. I was there. I wasn't there for that face-to-face conversation, but I was there with him on the radio when he said that, and people could see it coming, and he just would not stop. The draw of the money was just too much for him. And he's going to have to face the consequences of that. Number 4, the Republican takeover. That happened at the very beginning of this decade in 2010. Democrats had held power in the state of Alabama for 139 years. The fact that the Republicans not only took over, but had the trifecta. In other words, they had the House, the Senate, and the governorship. And by the way, in the state of Alabama, keep in mind that we also elect our judges. So they also had the Supreme Court. The fact that Alabama went from a Democrat stronghold, that they had controlled the government for 139 years, shows one of two things. I'll say it actually does show two things, because these things are both true. When it comes to a party, even if you have an absolute stranglehold like the Democrats had on the state government here, when you start ignoring your constituents, no matter how red or blue a state you happen to be in, it can change. And the second part of that plays off of the first point is why the Electoral College, people often decry this, well, basically 2 or 3 states decide the presidency. Yes, but those 2 or 3 states and which ones they are change constantly. That's the thing that people forget. One of the things that's so important to understand about politics is any party or candidate that ignores large enough groups of people for long enough are going to face the electoral consequences of that. The Democrats did so in the state of Alabama, and you see that at the national stage with certain states that people thought for sure were solid blue, like Wisconsin, going for Trump in this last election. That's why it's such a big story, because it reminds all of us that it doesn't matter how big or powerful or how safe you feel that you are, you can always lose power if you forget the people who gave you that power. Number 3, Doug Jones' election in 2017. Now, I don't think I have to explain why this one was such a big deal. I mean, with Doug Jones, a incredibly left-leaning Democrat, getting elected in a ruby red state, arguably the reddest state in the country, that could have only happened because there was a perfect storm of everything going on around him, and we'll get to one of those stories in a second. But with Luther Strange getting in the race, and then you had Mitch McConnell trying to back Luther Strange, and doing so trying to destroy and try to play with the chess pieces and trying to take down Mo Brooks so that he could win against Roy Moore, there were just so many moving parts of that story, and it seems as though every single little thing had to go exactly right to get a Democrat elected in the reddest state in the country. But hey, it happened. And that's one of the reasons that politics, though it's frustrating and can make you bleed through the eyes sometimes, it is fascinating to observe. Number 2, abortion is outlawed. This happens in 2019. I think we don't fully appreciate how far we've come. And maybe that's because it feels like we haven't come that far because abortion is still allowed, but I was seeing a statistic from Life News today that 79% of all of the abortion clinics that were open in 1991 have closed down now. We've seen a massive reduction in the availability of abortion because we have continued to fight this fight. And Alabama is on the front lines of it, and I could not be more proud of them. Alabama became the source of a lot of national news coverage in 2019, and the reason that I have it so high is not because of the level of coverage that we got or the people that were talking about Alabama, even though that was true when Alabama became the state that restricted abortion outright. According to the laws on the books in the state of Alabama right now, abortion is illegal. Of course, it's still going on because we'll have to see where it goes with the Supreme Court. But the fact is, on the books, our Constitution says that the unborn child is a life, and it says that abortion is outlawed because it is a violation of human rights. I think that history is going to look back and say, hey, the people of Alabama got it right. There was this barbaric practice of abortion where people were killing their own children, and the state of Alabama led the charge and said, no, we will stand up for those rights. We will stand up for the rights of those who cannot speak for themselves. And the fact that Alabama was the cradle of the civil rights movement that we talked about just a few minutes ago, I think the fact that we're leading the charge when it comes to protecting the unborn, that's going to be the next chapter in Alabama's history. And then finally, number 1, Robert Bentley scandal in 2017. Now, a lot of people would argue that it's not the most important story, but the reason that I say it is so incredibly important is because it had such a ripple effect. In a vacuum, I would agree. It's a big story. I think it's one of the top 10 of the decade. Doesn't deserve the number 1 spot. Here's why it does, though. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. The Robert Bentley scandal had ripple effects that changed the scope of everything in the state of Alabama. Because you'll remember that part of what people allege, and I say allege because technically we can't prove it, but I still believe that it's the case. The reason that Luther Strange got the senatorship, he was the attorney general that was overseeing the investigation into Robert Bentley's corruption and his affair with Rebecca Caldwell Mason. All of a sudden, he gets offered that open Senate seat from Jeff Sessions from Governor Bentley. And that reeks of corruption. It seems as though Governor Bentley was just trying to get Luther Strange out of his hair to keep him from investigating him by giving him a payoff and making him a U.S. Senator. So that happens. And whether it's true or not, the people of Alabama remembered it when the new governor, Kay Ivey, decided to go ahead and have a special election. And so you have Luther Strange becoming a senator. You have Doug Jones eventually winning that spot and becoming a senator. There are just so many ripple effects and ramifications. Aaliyah was completely turned upside down. They had to scramble for new leadership. Governor Ivey had to clean house with a lot of the Bentley appointees when it came to her taking over. And then, of course, Kay Ivey wound up becoming our elected governor, which, let's be honest, probably wouldn't have happened had she not been governor beforehand, just kind of by default. I'm not saying for sure it wouldn't have happened, but we'll never know. And so that's the reason I think this is the most important story in the state of Alabama. Now, the second one, and we'll go over this list very quickly, the top 10 overall stories, the top 10 most important stories to the world in 2010 to 2020. Number 10, Russia's war on the West, and that happened in 2013 and really is continuing to this day. You could argue that it never actually stopped, but the way that Russia has been going around the world, involving themselves in elections, helping out with Syria, allying themselves with Iran, the whole cyber war thing, the going around and trying to create insurgency in other countries to try to disrupt the electoral process. I mean, Russia has its sticky little fingers in everything. And I think that it has definitely been one of the big momentum stories in the 2010s. Number 9, the killing of Osama bin Laden. So Osama bin Laden, the guy responsible for 9/11, winds up meeting his maker, and I have a feeling that that meeting did not go well, in 2011. I think that that's a really big deal. And President Obama deserves credit for giving the order. And what's most important, and I said this for al-Baghdadi as well, the people that deserve the most credit are the troops that carried it out and the intelligence people that were working on it to make sure we knew where the guy was. That was just a victory for America in general. Number 8, social media censorship. This really kind of started in earnest in 2015 and continues on to this day. We found out that there were companies like Twitter that were saying, no, we're not shadow banning people, where it turns out, oh yes, they absolutely are. You've also got YouTube that swears they're not shadow banning people, and it turns out that they are. We're seeing censorship sometimes on both sides, primarily on the right. When it comes to Facebook, people like me have been censored, conservatives have been censored, people that didn't deserve it, that it was just kind of a mistake, got censored. Social media censorship and how we deal with this new medium is really going to affect our future, and that's part of the reason that it was such an impactful story. Now, another one, I could spend a whole show on this, but I'm just going to say it outright. It kind of started in 2015, and it's been really going ever since. The rise of populism. And this has led in many ways to the election of President Trump, the election of Boris Johnson over in the UK. There has been a widespread movement across the country. And remember, populism is not a political ideology. Populism is merely a method. And it's a method that had kind of largely gone by the wayside up until President Trump and other people kind of followed suit. And whether or not Trump was the originator of it, or it was just kind of time for something like this to happen, who can say? But the rise of populism has had real world effects. I mean, you can look at Brexit as a perfect example of this. But what does concern me is that sort of a part of the rise of populism also came the rise of nationalism, which is a political ideology, and one that is terrifying and based on racism. And that's one that I'm really, really trying to stay away from. And I think that a lot of the people that are trying to at least toy with the idea of nationalism do so at their own peril. Now, in 2015, we're staying in 2015 apparently, Obergefell and its aftermath. The reason that we're seeing everything we are with the trans movement, with the like the lawsuits with the Christian bakers and everything, it all goes back to Obergefell. Now, you may recall that conservatives like myself were predicting all of these things and said that they would come to pass if we ever made gay marriage universal and nationally accepted. And we were right. Now we can't even figure out what bathroom we're supposed to use, or whether or not men that were born men are allowed to beat up women in women's sports, or to take all of the first place trophies in women's track and field. There has been so many unintended consequences that a lot of people, even on the left, are saying, no, we wanted the gay marriage, but we didn't want that. But that's what you got. The reason this is such an important story is because it essentially said we legally recognize that we are the ones that get to decide what marriage is, not God. From the time of our founding onward, marriage was always seen as something that was primarily established by God. Now, there's arguments on both sides whether or not we should legally recognize marriage or not. I tend to be more on the let's not legally recognize marriage side. But the point is, even a lot of those people still saw marriage as an institution that was created by God, and he was the one that got to define what it actually was. The Obergefell decision said, no, government decides what marriage is, and we get to define it, and it is this. Our pride and our hubris is going to lead us to a very bad place in that. Number 4, and there were so many news stories connected to this one, it would be hard to even scratch the surface. ISIS. Because you'll remember that ISIS really started coming to prominence in 2013. They kind of hit their zenith about 2015, and they started to dwindle around late 2016, really started kind of losing steam in 2017 onward. And this really happened, the rise, they had their origin, I guess, in the rise of Iraqi's forces, unfortunately, that were trained and armed by Americans. And Iraq and Iraq and Syrian forces kind of banded together to create this, what they were attempting to do was create a global caliphate. The Syrian civil war took place where ISIS was victorious. And then, and this is another reason why this was such a big deal, you had the refugee crisis of 2014. This was the biggest refugee crisis since World War II. I mean, Europe was being absolutely flooded with refugees. America took quite a bit as well. And so there were all the implications that came along with that. You had some countries, like I believe it was Sweden, that was one of the most peaceful countries in the world, all of a sudden became one of the highest rape rates, that's hard to say, of any country in Europe. I mean, that's staggering. So, kind of like the Robert Bentley thing in the Alabama list, the reason that the ISIS story is so big is not only because of the story in and of itself, but because it also had ripple effects that just created all kinds of scenarios that people had to figure out, okay, how do we deal with this? And even though I wouldn't say that ISIS is something to not even be considered anymore, they have largely been defeated, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that we finally got al-Baghdadi in 2019. So hopefully that is not something that is a recurring news story. Number 3, the surveillance state. This really took place in 2010 and has continued on ever since. We have legitimate concerns about what's been going on with WikiLeaks and Snowden. And you may also remember this clip of Jake Tapper, who at the time was in charge of the NSA. He was America's top spy, telling Congress that, no, the government's not taking any of your data. They're not collecting data on anybody. When we found out later, no, that was a bald-faced lie. He was lying and perjuring himself directly to Congress.
So what I wanted to see is if you could give me a yes or no answer to the question, does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans?
No, sir.
It does not.
Not wittingly. There are cases where they could inadvertently, perhaps, collect, but not wittingly.
So there was James Clapper, General James Clapper. By the way, that's Robert Mueller in the background, in case you were wondering. There's James Clapper saying, no, we're not collecting data. Not wittingly. We're not knowingly doing it. We're not collecting data on American citizens. Yeah, it turns out about 6 months later we found out, yeah, they absolutely are. Collecting millions and millions of bytes of metadata on us. And by the way, keeping the underlying data, just not using it. They're storing it, which doesn't exactly fill me with confidence, especially after the guy in charge of the NSA was lying to my face about it, about even having that data. And what's really terrifying is when you see this sort of merger between big tech and the government. And this is what we're seeing. This is the newest part of this ongoing story about the surveillance state is what we're seeing now is the government kind of collaborating and working together with these big tech companies to create an even scarier and more advanced surveillance state. You know, it's interesting that people on the left were always afraid of big corporations and people on the right were always afraid of the government. And while we're still fighting with each other over that, a lot of the big corporations is working with the government to figure out how to control us. Unfortunately, that is the case that we seem to kind of find ourselves in. Number two, the abortion fight renewed. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I already talked about it a little bit in our first list. But up until the New York law, I think that was really the big turning point. You saw a lot of Christians and a lot of churches that had really kind of fallen asleep on the abortion issue. Now, people like me never did just because I'm so involved in politics. It's something that is a ever-present force in my life. But there were an awful lot of Christians that weren't in the news business, that didn't really pay a whole lot of attention to politics, that they were kind of sleepwalking through pretty much everything since the 90s. And then all of a sudden, when the New York law came out, they're like, oh wow, these people are serious about abortion on demand. And so they finally woke up and said, yeah, this is a fight that we are supposed to have. So it changed a lot of things in a lot of ways for the country. And I am really, really thrilled to see that we are making a lot of inroads. And I think that we are on the cusp. I don't think it'll be much longer. I think my generation will see the end of the barbaric, paganistic practice of abortion. And finally, number one, you think, well, what could top the number two story, Caleb? Well, it's a story that really, it had started a long time ago, but it came to a head in 2016. And that was because Bernie Sanders burst onto the scene. See, the number one story to me about this past decade is they finally took the mask off. Socialists finally quit lying to us and telling us, no, we're just Democrats. We just believe in a generous welfare state. And now they're saying, nope, we're socialists. We're full-on Marxist. They may say, oh, well, we're democratic socialist, which is like saying, no, we're not ice cream. We're vanilla ice cream. Yeah, you're still freaking ice cream. I'm not worried about the vanilla part. I'm worried about the ice cream part. Now, I would never... it's funny. It's socialists don't really have ice cream, but because there's no capitalism to create it. But anyway, no, the fact that the political class and the people on the left finally decided, nope, we're not hiding anymore. We're just going to take off the mask. We're going to straight up tell people we're socialist and we're proud to be socialist. We're not ashamed of it. This is who we are. See, we're finally getting to the point to where we can have a real choice, where people can honestly look at the options and say, all right, do you want this or do you want this? Do you want full-on socialism or do you like capitalism? Do you like free markets? Do you like where we are? Because for the longest time, we were not having an honest debate. We had people that were socialists pretending that they were not and just espousing all of the socialist ideas and all of the socialist policies, but saying, but we're not socialists. We're just Democrats. Well, now they're at least being honest about it. And I like that. Because we can finally have a conversation. Do you want an actual free republic with a free market, or do you want a government to control everything in your life? That's the conversation we should be having. Now, to a great degree, we're still not having it, but at least now the mask is off, and we can use that label, and they can't say that, oh, we're racist. Because remember, it used to be racist to even suggest that Obama was a socialist. I don't know how many times I would say that and say, no, you're racist. And now you're looking at the Democrat Party and they're all saying, no, we are socialists. We're embracing it. Look at the Democrat field right now. The vast majority of them are either admitting to be socialist or saying that they have socialist ideas. I mean, really, Joe Biden's the only, and Michael Bloomberg now that he's got in, even though I would say that he's a socialist too. But they're the only ones even trying to put any distance between them and socialism. The rest have just blatantly said, you know what, we're socialist and we're okay with that. I think that is the biggest news story of the decade. That is the one that is going to have the most impact on America going forward. All right, let's go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Chaplain's Report today, this one's dedicated to my friend Mark Montiel. If you were listening to him on the radio, especially in the year before he wound up leaving, you may recall that one of the things that he loved to talk about the most, and he used this term over and over again, the storms in people's life. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that he was going through a storm in his own life. And I'm not going to get into any details, but he was going through one of the most traumatic things a person can go through. And every single day, he still got on the air and talked to other people about their problems. That was just part of who the man was. But he loved talking about this, I think not because he liked hearing about other people's pain, but because he wanted to help them with that. And sometimes he understood that the best way to do that was to talk about it and try to figure out a game plan of, okay, how do we figure out how to get through this storm? How do we deal with this storm that's there? Let's not be in denial about it being here. Let's figure out a solution. He talked about the storms of life just coming up like the weather, sometimes without any warning, and you just have to deal with it and figure out a way to bunker down and to weather that storm until it's over. And so in his honor, I wanted to do a story about that. And our passage today comes from the book of Luke, chapter 8. It's a story I'm sure most of us are familiar with. But as they were sailing along, he talking about Jesus here, of course, fell asleep, and a fierce gale of wind descended on the lake, and they began to be swamped and to be in danger. They came to Jesus and woke him, saying, Master, Master, we are perishing. And he got up and rebuked the wind and the surging waves, and they stopped, and it became calm. And he said to them, Where is your faith? They were fearful and amazed, saying to one another, Who then is this, that he commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him? This was one of Judge Montiel's favorite passages in the Scripture. And I have to agree. One of the reasons it's so impactful is because it shows the apostles, who many people often think of as these great spiritual giants that just didn't have any problems, that they had this stalwart faith, that they died for their beliefs. Yeah, but they didn't start out that way. They started out like you and me, having all kinds of doubts. They saw this storm, and keep in mind, a lot of these guys, not all of them, but a lot of them were fishermen. They were kind of accustomed to storms on the sea, and this one was one where they're like, oh gosh, we're going to die. There's no way we survive this. That's how they saw this storm. And Jesus, who is asleep in the hull of the ship, which I find hilarious, they wake him up, and he's just kind of waking up from his sleep, and he's like, where's your faith? You guys realize I'm in the boat with you, right? Why were you afraid that you were going to die? Now, maybe I'm reading a little too much into that because I'm a sarcastic person, and because of that, sometimes I think of Jesus being a little bit sarcastic too. But you'll notice that he didn't scold them in the sense that he fixed the problem. Like why would he scold them if he was just going to get up and fix the problem, which he did anyway? I think a lot of it had to do with teaching them a lesson because, see, the storm was not the issue. The storm wasn't the problem. Their faith was the problem. See, they should have had enough faith that the storm could have continued on and they would have been fine. But the question is, why would they have been fine? Because Jesus was in the boat with them. Jesus' mere presence in their boat, or to us, presence in our life, should be enough for us to know that we're going to be okay. Storms are going to come. They're going to look really, really bad. And there's going to be times where there's doubt in our mind and we think, how on earth are we ever going to get through this? How do we survive this? There's no way. There's no way that we get through this. But what should change that for us, what should give us perspective and to know, no, we can make it. We'll be okay, is that we know that Jesus is in the boat with us. You see, Jesus uses this as a teaching moment. He teaches us about his power, about his ability. And when we do have the storms in life, yeah, Jesus has the power to just step in and go, peace be still. Okay, it's done. I'm going to go back and finish my nap. That could have happened. And that's something that Jesus can do for us. Any problem that we're having, it's not too big for Jesus. He can just walk out the boat and say, it's done, and it's done. Simple as that. But the thing that he's trying to tell them here is, if you had the right kind of faith, you wouldn't need to see me calm the storm. You wouldn't need to get me up and disturb me from my nap. Not that Jesus was like mad at them or anything, but you know what I'm saying. He's like, you wouldn't need to have done that because you know I'm here with you, so you're going to be able to weather the storm anyway. See, I think sometimes, especially as young Christians, we make the mistake of asking God to just get rid of the storms. Whenever we're doing something, Lord, just please make this go away. Lord, please just make whatever I'm doing through, whether it's the death of a family member or some kind of horrible sickness or financial trouble, whatever it is, Lord, just make this go away for me, please. And there's nothing wrong with making that request, but ultimately, shouldn't we want to get to the point to where what we're actually praying for is, Lord, give me the strength to get through this storm. Lord, help me see the way out. Help me to make it through. Give me the endurance I need to do so, to navigate this water and to make me stronger in the process. See, that's the kind of faith that Jesus was looking for in his apostles. They came short in this instance, but eventually, much later, after years of walking with Jesus and walking the path of a disciple, they get to that kind of faith. And that's what it takes. And I guarantee you, because I don't claim to know the man super well, but I did get to know him pretty well over the brief time that I was allowed to have with him. I'm telling you right now, if Judge Montiel were here, that would be the message that he would give to you. That God can get you through any storm. Maybe he comes and fixes it and it just goes away. Or maybe he expects you to actually navigate the waters yourself and just trust because he's in the boat with you that you'll make it through. But here's the thing, he has to be in the boat with you for that to work. If Jesus is not a part of your life, if he's not in your boat, as it were, then the storm might actually destroy you. There is a chance that that could take place. And that's part of the reason that you need to invite him in. Because once you've done that, the storm can't hurt you no matter how bad it is. It may rough you up, it may scare you, but it's not gonna take you down. It's not gonna sink you. Because it's not going to sink a boat. It doesn't have the power. There is not a storm strong enough to take you down when Jesus is in the boat with you. Stay the course, friends.
Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Any opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media. The theme song for Tactics is 6 Foot Town by Big and Rich. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Broadcast studios provided by Cumulus Media Montgomery. Location studios provided by